and welcome to the Hometown Church Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm your host, Jesse Roskamp, and I am joined by Pastor Brent Knox. How you doing today, Brent?
Well, I'm doing great. I had a nice Memorial weekend. I had a nice day yesterday sitting on the deck and grilling with my wife and my son, and ate too much, but it was a nice day. So
there you go. That sounds awesome.
It was a good day.
Yeah, I just worked most of the weekend.
Yeah, so. Good for you. Those kitchen cabinets of yours, right?
Yeah, redoing my kitchen cabinets, and that's I don't recommend it for those who are thinking about doing it. Pay someone else to do it.
Well, you're young. You can learn lessons like that.
I suffered through it, but I've got my war wounds from it. Got my finger all cut up, which is nice. Yeah. But we survived. Today, we are continuing our series through the book of Joshua. On our Sunday service, we have been going through this series called Courageous Faith, where we've been looking at the stories within Joshua. We haven't exactly been going verse by verse, but we've been really trekking through this story of the Israelites heading into the Promised Land and looking at how God keeps his promises that he made to the Israelites many generations before, and continues to hold those going into this new generation, heading into the Promised Land, and actually fulfilling all of those promises that we see. And so we see just the response of the people. We see this response of this new leader. Joshua is kind of taking up this big mantle, stepping into the shoes of one of the most well-known leaders in Israel's history, right? Moses, this great legendary man, and now he's got to be taking this spot and doing these things. And we see how he's kind of carrying these people into this new season. And so here on the podcast, we've been kind of using this as a companion piece to that sermon series by being able to kind of look at this for more of a Bible study perspective. And we've been really keying in on how Joshua points us to the gospel and points us to the person of Jesus, and how we can see God's character through this story, and really getting the opportunity to address some of the harder questions that kind of arise as we read this really challenging book of the Old Testament. So before we get into the chapters we're going to cover today, we're going to be covering chapters 3 and 4. Let's have a little review of what we've read so far. So let's talk about how the book of Joshua points us to the person of Jesus. How does this book magnify Jesus and stir our hearts to worshiping him?
Well, you introduced the book by talking about how Moses was legendary, and Joshua kind of fills in his shoes, and in his own sense, Joshua becomes legendary, one of those heroes of the Old Testament of the Bible. And I think it's really important as we back up a little bit here that the real hero of the big mega story of our salvation is Jesus, and that the whole Bible really is focusing on the unfolding story of Jesus. So in that sense, all the heroes in the Bible are like types or foreshadows that point us to Jesus, because Jesus is the real hero. And I think this is important to keep in mind, because when we have a tendency as we read our Bibles to place ourselves in the hero's shoes that we read. So we read about David, and we want to face our same giants. We got giants in our life. We want to face giants like David did, or Daniel. We want to be courageous, or like Daniel's friends who went into the furnace and stood firm for the truth, stood firm for God. And then we read about Joshua, and we want to be strong and courageous like Joshua. We want to be like that, and that's fine. But the one who was really strong, really courageous, really obedient, and really submissive was Jesus. And if we place ourselves in anybody's shoes as we're reading through the book of Joshua, it should be the normal Joe Israelite in the ranks, who really needed a leader and needed to be led to victory. So praise God, we have our own Joshua, who is a better leader, who is more courageous, more obedient, and certainly more powerful than Joshua. And I keep thinking, I was thinking about this morning, placing myself in the shoes of a normal Israelite who needed to be led into the Promised Land. And how grateful would they be to Joshua for leading Israel into the Promised Land? But even more so, We ought to be worshiping Jesus for leading us into our promised land. And we're going to be talking about that here down the road here today a little bit. So I'm encourage us all to place ourselves in the normal Joe Israelite, in their shoes, as we read through the book of Joshua. And, we've mentioned this in previous podcasts as well. There's the parallels between Jesus and Joshua are just so striking. Both bear the same meaning of their names, that Yahweh saves. Both Jesus and Joshua have basically that in common. Both are commissioned to bring salvation. Both are commanders. Joshua is the commander of the armies of the Jews. Jesus is the commander of the armies of heaven. God's people were called to follow both. Both were very strong, very courageous. Both defeat the enemies of God's people. But Joshua's victories were only over human beings, human adversaries. But Jesus, his victories are even greater. They're over spiritual forces. They're over sin. They're over death. They're over Satan. Both lead God's people into rest, but Joshua only led God's people into a physical rest. But Jesus is leading God's people into something far deeper, far greater, and that is a spiritual rest. So the parallels here is just so striking.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I think we've talked about this and we'll continue to kind of talk about this, but I think there's that tendency, that temptation for us to read ourselves into the story. And I really love highlighting the fact that we should be looking for Jesus rather than ourselves in these stories, and looking for the things that are foreshadowing or pointing us to the gospel, and really putting all of our attention on the real hero of the story. So I think that's really good. And one thing that we're really focusing on here is the faithfulness of God. So how does the book of Joshua point us towards worshiping God for his faithfulness?
Well, the book of Joshua is a really crucial point in the history of the Jews. Significant promises are starting to come true. I mean, after 600 years, imagine 600 years, God, when he made his promises to Abraham, is the time frame to where Joshua is entering into the land. That's 600-year time frame. You go back 600 years in the history of our country. You go back to when Christopher Columbus discovered America. That is a long time. But even though it's a long time, God is being faithful to his promises. It's just that he's usually not on our timetable, right? Mm-hmm. And with this story, we see that in living color. God is faithful. There's these incredible promises that are unfolding right before the Israelites' eyes. And we can take that to bank because we also have incredible promises that are going to unfold right in front of our eyes too. But there, in chapter 3 and 4, which we're going to zero in on today, there is a micro story here of God's faithfulness. There is this crossing of a body of water that's miraculous, and it's commemorated with placing big stones so that future generations can observe and remember and proclaim that in that moment, God was also faithful as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think it's really kind of summarizes really just what this whole book is about. It is showing who God is through this, and really how he has kept his promises, how this little seed that was planted with Abraham has grown and grown and grown, and they've been waiting and waiting, and they've gone through so much hardships, and finally they're starting to see that blossom into something really cool and really beautiful. Where we get to see this. But we're going to kind of kick this off by just kind of summarizing the two chapters that we read this week, which is Joshua 3 and 4. And so we left off with the story of Rahab, right? So Joshua, he sends in the 2 spies into Jericho. They're kind of scouting out the land. They want to get a feel for it. And they get taken in by this prostitute Rahab, who kind of confesses that yeah, I think, Yahweh is the true God, the one who created the heavens and the earth, and I'm going to protect you guys and get you guys out of here so that you guys can come back. But when you do, remember me, right? Like, don't destroy me too. And so they hold that promise, and they get back. They tell Joshua, hey, people are scared. Like, they have heard about what happened at the Red Sea, and they know who's coming. Like, they know that Yahweh is on our side, and he is going to conquer, right? And so Joshua gets this report, and that next day they set out. They head to the Jordan River, which is kind of the boundary line of the Promised Land, and this big rushing, flowing river. And right there, God gives them the command to cross over the Jordan. And so they start. The priests get in the water first, and the waters start to part. They get there and they stand in the middle with the Ark of the Covenant going out in front of the people. The ground gets dried up. All the people of Israel flow through. They get to the other side and they're like, hey, grab 12 of these stones, bring them to the other side, and these are going to be your memorial. And so they're able to kind of have this replay of this this scene that their fathers saw when they were leaving Egypt, of this massive body of water that seems to be something that they're unable to cross, but God performs a miracle right in front of their eyes through one of the leaders in order to give them a pathway to get to the other side of this thing. And so that's kind of where we're at right now for chapters 3 and 4. But let's kind of break it down here with a couple thoughts. First, we've kind of already mentioned that this is a replay of the Red Sea moment, right? This is kind of a new chance for God to show off his power, show who he is, and he does it in a very similar way that he did with the previous generation by parting this big body of water for the people to walk through and cross to the other side. How do these two moments kind of compare and contrast with each other?
Yeah, it's amazing that God had two huge crossings of two waters to two different generations. So we have a generation that is different from their forefathers. Their forefathers were not really marked by the Red Sea incident. You'd think it would be, but as it played out, they caved into their fear and anxieties and went into the Promised Land. So we have this next generation that is now facing a similar issue. They're facing an obstacle and need to cross over. These two crossings of this big bodies of water have always amazed me. It's such an incredible display of power, both of them. Red Sea was a lot bigger, but there's one little detail in both of them that just have amazed me. They did it on dry land. Now, you think at least it would be muddy. But God not only parted the waters, he made the land dry. God just doesn't do miracles that are incomplete. He went the whole way. I mean, after all, they had carts and stuff. All of it needed to be navigable. And with both crossings, it happened on dry land. But these crossings, even though they're similar, do seem to emphasize something a little different. The Red Sea emphasizes God's amazing rescue. This is where the Israelites were delivered. And in a real way, that's the moment they got saved. And this is the event that the Israelites were commanded to look back on and say, yeah, I know that God is for me. God is for his people. And I know that because of our national rescue at the Red Sea. I mean, what more could God have done to prove his affection, his commitment to his people than to save them like he did at the Red Sea? And in this sense, this foreshadows the powerful work of Jesus. We look back on the moment of our rescue, the moment of our deliverance. And one verse that I have been thinking about for weeks and weeks and weeks now is in Colossians 1, where it says, Paul is praying for the Colossians, and he says, may God fill you with joy, always thanking the Father. He has enabled you to share in the inheritance that belongs to his people who live in the light. For he has rescued us from the kingdom of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his dear Son, who purchased our freedom and forgave our sins. In a real way, we've been rescued too, just like the Israelites were. In a real way, we were transferred from one kingdom to another. In the same way that the Israelites were. They were rescued out of the kingdom of the Pharaoh, the dark kingdom of Pharaoh, and brought into a new kingdom under the kingship of God. And that ought to fill us with great joy. And in my quiet times, I sit there and I thank God for that. I think, listen, that day that I got saved, I was rescued. That day I got saved, I was transferred from one king to another. And the whole trajectory of my life changed. Same thing had happened with the Israelites. And, let's just meditate on the issue of power for a moment. The power that was exerted at the Red Sea. How much power, Jesse, do you think was exerted at the Red Sea by God?
Quite a bit, I suppose.
I mean, you imagine these tall walls of water that they're walking between. How I would have been tempted just to put my hand into the wall of water. A whole sea parted. But how much power was exerted at the cross and at the resurrection? I mean, we're amazed at the power that was exerted at the Red Sea. But even more power was exerted at the cross and the resurrection. I mean, all the sin, our sin of the whole world, was placed on the body of Jesus. He became sin so that we might become the righteousness of God. He broke the power of sin. He broke the power of death. I mean, the Israelites, they were released from physical slavery, but we were released from spiritual slavery. And Paul, in the book of Colossians, or Ephesians, he asks God that God would open their eyes to the power that God exerted when He rose Jesus Christ from the dead. And that's what the Red Sea ought to be reminding us of. It was the rescue of Israel and the power of God that was exerted to rescue Israel. But the Jordan River seems to emphasize something a little different. They're entering into an inheritance. They're entering into kind of a way of life. And with that, they are called to obedience. And we're going to see that here in a little bit. They're called to advance as an army. They're called to make an act of faith, to take a step of faith. They were to step into the water. That never happened at the Red Sea. The Red Sea, they just sat there and God saved them and they did nothing. But with the Jordan River, they're called to take a step of faith, and the Jordan is at this flood stage. And beyond that, once you cross the Jordan, and presumably the Jordan would fill back in behind you, there was no escape. You were in that land now facing those giants, no escape. It was a step of faith to follow God into that. And I think in a sense that the Jordan River kind of foreshadows for us the Christian life, that God's bringing us into this life that He intends for His people. And it starts with a step of faith. We're called to walk by faith. Sometimes He just waits for our obedience before He reveals His power, just like He did with the Israelites there. We need to get outside our comfort zones, and we're to continue to take steps of faith rather than just sitting still. And we're to advance with the gospel and expand the kingdom, just like the Israelites were called to expand into the promised land. And we're to follow Jesus. We're going to be talking about this in a moment, what the Ark of the Covenant represents. They followed God by following the Ark. And the battles in the land seem to foreshadow our own spiritual battles. And so I think that's how those two crossings compare and contrast a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you hit it right on the nose. I think the thing that was coming into my mind was the first one was a defensive thing, right? Like they're backed up against the wall and they're running. They're being pursued by the Egyptians, and so we see the presence of the Lord in the cloud, the pillar of cloud and fire, right? That kind of swings back around them and protects them for the Egyptians as they cross through. The second one was offensive. It was them going, and so the presence of the Lord is in the Ark of the Covenant now, going before them, parking in the middle of the river and allowing them to pass through safely. So we get that kind of contrast. I also thought it was really interesting, just kind of like thematically going with that, of like the first one signifying deliverance, the second one signifying inheritance. Is the first one happens in the middle of the night, right? And so they're being delivered from darkness into light. And the second one happens right away in the morning. And so they're already in the light and they're being brought into something new and beautiful that they get to keep going forward in. So I thought that was just really interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the Ark of the Covenant then, because that is a big part of this story, and it's a pretty significant thing that kind of keeps popping up throughout the Old Testament, right? What is the significance of the Ark of the Covenant?
Well, it does seem to have pretty significant here in this chapter. I mean, it's mentioned 11 times in Joshua chapter 3. And let's just say it's a little different than how it's portrayed in the Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Well, that's like what I have in my mind.
Historically accurate movie. That was the Ark there was kind of portrayed as kind of like a good luck charm. I mean, whoever had it had power, right? Well, that's not the point here of the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark really is a symbol of God's presence. It's in fact called the throne footstool of Yahweh. It's mentioned that in a couple times in the Old Testament. And what's inside the Ark is important too. And so what was inside the Ark? Well, there was the golden jar of manna. There was Aaron's rod that budded. And then there were the actual 10 commandments that were carved out on stone that Moses brought back from the Mount Sinai. And each of these items inside the Ark were important and signified something important to the Israelites, but they themselves are also a foreshadowing of Jesus in a way. So we've got the stone tablets that represented God's supernatural moral law. That was the foundation of his covenant with Israel. They were supernaturally given, and it's reminding the Israelites that they've made an agreement with God and that they are to be obedient, that God is a king. God is a king who speaks to his people, and it foreshadows Jesus in the sense that he becomes the true law keeper for us. I mean, who could, in their own ability, obey those 10 commandments completely and thoroughly? No one. What those 10 commandments really do is show us what sin is and define sin. And Jesus becomes the lawgiver, the true lawgiver for us. And through the new covenant, then the law gets written on our hearts as opposed to being written on stone tablets. So there's the stone tablets that are inside the Ark, and then there's Aaron's rod that budded. And I think this is this dead piece of stick ends up having a resurrection. It leaves and produces fruit as a way of symbolizing and proving to the Israelites that when they were attempting in their own rebellion, this is earlier in number 17, in their own rebellion, wanting to be mediators between themselves and God and taking the place of the Aaron priesthood, God had to prove to them, no, you can't do that. And that in a sense is foreshadowing Jesus. We cannot mediate between us and God ourselves. We need a mediator, a perfect mediator that we got to rely on and trust in. We can't step in and do that work ourselves. And it needs to be, and Jesus being the great mediator was proven in the same way Aaron's rod proved a resurrection by resurrection. Jesus himself resurrected. And then there's the golden jar of manna. And this manna, this jar collected some of the manna that ended up God giving to the Israelites when they were going through the desert. So God gave them miraculously food when they were going through the desert. And it was a perpetual reminder that God sustains his people. And it was a sample of how God provided for the people in the desert. And I think that foreshadows Jesus too, that he's the true bread from heaven. And we're called to live in daily dependence on him, that he provides for our every need, just how he provided for the Israelites when they're out in the desert. So we got these three really important artifacts that are being carried in the Ark. And this whole Ark becomes a symbol of God's presence. And later, it was moved into the temple. But there the Ark is out there leading the Israelites, and it provided a reminder of God's presence and a reminder of God's kingship over them. And so it provided direction. If the Ark moved, the Israelites moved. If the Ark stopped, the Israelites stopped. God's the one who provides direction. We're to look to God for direction and for decision making. He is our king. Let him be the one who calls the shots. And I think it's also reminding us and the Israelites that God is leading the way. God's going before us. He's fighting the battles. Israel wasn't conquering the land by their own initiative. God was going first. God is the source of victory. And then I think finally, this ark, they were told that they were to follow the ark at a distance. There's some separation here. Follow God at a distance, and reminding the Israelites that God's holiness needs to be honored. So the distance, the priests, all the rituals that are surrounding that all reinforce the idea that God's not common, but he's must be treated carefully. So even in this whole sense, I think the Ark of the Covenant foreshadows Christ. The ark is a type of Christ, God's presence is among his people. He's the one that goes before us. He's the one who opens up our way to God's promises. And then just as the ark stood in the Jordan so Israel could pass through safely, Christ stands in the waters of death so that we can enter into a new creation.
Yeah. As you were talking there, and I was just kind of like thinking through this. This is kind of a curveball question for you, so we'll see where this goes.
Was this thrown out to me in advance?
No, it was not. But I was just thinking about it now, and I'm just curious to get your thoughts on it. Of like, what do you think the difference is between the ark and like other pagan idols that like the Canaanites were worshiping and stuff like that? Because the ark does represent the presence of God. Like this, his presence was there with the ark, and there's like an actual danger of like coming and touching the ark on improper terms and like coming into the Holy of Holies. And God specifically is like, don't make idols, right? But here's like this physical thing that is representing the presence of God in some way that the Israelites are carrying around with them into battle. But like, what makes that different from the idols that the pagans were, like the Canaanites were worshiping at the time?
Well, I think that one of the main differences is that the all these rituals that God gave Israel, all the ceremony that God gave Israel, the objects that God gave Israel were teaching them. Mm-hmm. They were teaching them about something bigger and better that was to come. Mm-hmm. I think with the main difference with the idols that are around in different cultures, that was it. That was the end of the story. But all those the items in the ark, the way the temple worked, the way the rituals of the priest occurred, all those were teaching tools to prepare Israel's mind for the greater fulfillment with Jesus Christ. They were pointing to the true worship of God. And I think that's probably the main difference.
Yeah, the ark wasn't God, but it was a reminder of the presence of God.
Yep.
And there is real danger in the presence of God, which is something like I guess my mind. I'm thinking about like the story in Judges, right? Which is like the Ark of the Covenant kind of has its own little side quest in the book of Judges. You remember this? So the Israelites, they're going into battle. They're like, how are we going to win this battle? Oh, I know. Let's go grab the Ark of the Covenant and bring it with us, and then God's gonna give us victory here. Which is not how it works, right?
Well, they were almost doing the Ark of the Covenant via what happened in the Raiders of the Lost Ark. It was a good luck charm.
Yeah, they're like, this is our God. Like, if we bring him with us, he's going to win the battle for us. And so they get destroyed because that's not how it works, right? Like it is God leading them, not them taking God to win their battles for them. And the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant. And then we get a couple chapters of just following the Ark of the Covenant with the Philistines as like what's happening. They like go put it in like their trophy room with this idol for Dagon, their god, and they leave the room and they come back and this the idol is like knocked
Statue
over and
that's fallen
destroyed.
over, yeah.
Yeah, and then like the people start getting sick and stuff because like the power of God is actually making things happen. It's not that the ark is God, right? But that this thing that does belong to the Israelites is supposed to be over with them. It does not belong with the Philistines right now. Is like causing all this havoc, and they finally bring it back. But I just think of that story always when I think of the Ark of the Covenant. I think it's just a funny little like side story that's happening. But yeah, I do think it's just it is interesting how it does hold this like special significant place, and there is power surrounding this thing, but it is not God. It is just a reminder. It's just a thing at the end of the day that is used and is very significant towards these people. But at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's a symbol.
Right. And God gave a lot of symbols, a lot of objects, a lot of ceremony, a lot of rituals to the Israelites as a kind of a teaching tool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Joshua chapter 3, verse 5. I think it's a really interesting verse, and I'll read it out loud here. It says, Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves because the Lord will do wonders among you tomorrow. What is the significance of that verse?
Well, there probably could be a number of ways to look at this that we could draw out its significance, and you might have one or two up your sleeve here too, but I'm keeping in mind the context here. We have this nation of slaves that's about ready to cross over into enemy territory and then be trapped by a river when it closes behind them. And I think it's interesting that Joshua doesn't say, sharpen your swords, load up your arrows, practice your fighting skills, get all psyched up, get ready for tomorrow we enter into enemy territory. It doesn't say that. He says, consecrate yourselves, or get your lives right, purify yourselves, and set yourself apart, which is what that Hebrew word means, set apart, make holy. And this was a whole person readiness, getting your heart, your mind, your body all set, because God is about ready to reveal himself. And I think it should tell us powerfully about God's priorities. Holiness is more important than strength. Holiness is more important than strategy. We're to be right with God and please God with our personal lives. This is what God cares about the most. And we're going to be facing many battles. We're going to need a lot of wisdom in our lives. But we first need to walk in a way that pleases him and walk in a way that's worthy of him, lining ourselves right with him, and then trust God that he's going to give us the wisdom, the power, and the ability to move forward. I think what this does is this shows us the priorities of God. It's not battle strategy.
Mm-hmm.
It's holiness and walking with God.
Yeah. Yeah, it's aligning yourself with him in your heart posture first before he acts in these kind of miraculous ways.
Yeah, and we see that in various places in Joshua, actually, that spiritual preparation is consistently outweighs military preparation.
So what do you think that means for us now? How do we like consecrate ourselves now to prepare for the Lord working in our lives?
I think I'll just use a little personal illustration on maybe even getting ready for this podcast. This morning I wake up and I have a quiet time and I'm working through the Psalms, and I have a real choice on whether I'm working over my own heart or whether I'm working on preparation for the podcast. And I have learned over the years that God is looking first that I am re-giving my heart and my affection over to him, yielding to him, letting him speak to me, and that spiritual preparation is more important than actually coming up with all the right answers that Jesse might ask me.
Mhm.
That would be
Yeah.
a personal way that I might apply that.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a like willingly submitting to the Lord, and recognizing the dependence that we have on Him, right? Because I think that's mainly what it means. Like there's not much that we can do to like make ourselves holy, right? For the Israelites, there was practices that they would do, but I think even the word talks about like it's not like these things actually had much power in them. Like they were following and they're being obedient, but ultimately they didn't save them in the end, right? Like these things couldn't fully make them clean. It had to be the sacrifice of Jesus that eventually came along. It was Him. But there's kind of this sentiment throughout that God always responds to a repentant heart. I was just reading this in Ezekiel this morning. Of with the righteous man, one wicked deed will make him wicked and subject to judgment, right? But for the wicked man, one righteous deed, or repenting and turning to righteousness will make him righteous. So God constantly is responding to repentance, and so at the end of the day, it's not the works that matter, but it's the position of your heart that matters, and the direction that you're going.
Right. And can I add to that?
Yeah.
I think this is an interesting phrase here, that this verse, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow you'll see great wonders. It's also setting up what we're going to be talking about soon with Achan's sin.
Mm.
Because there was a person who didn't consecrate himself.
Yeah.
And I think we're getting a real signal here is God really cares
Yeah.
about sin. So another practical application of this might be if you know that your brother has something against you, he says in the Sermon on the Mount, go get it right before you come to the altar of God.
Mm-hmm.
God cares about us being right with one another, right with Him, and sin is a priority for God. If we're holding out on God, that's what He cares about. He wants us to obey. He wants us to walk in a manner worthy of Him. Not that we will necessarily do that perfectly all the time. You mentioned He really cares about repentance, but this is showing us His priority. If we've got outstanding areas in our life that we haven't gotten right with Him, that's what He cares about more than we're performing well at work or we're getting our house projects done or whatever it is. He cares that we get our lives right with Him, and we're going to see in a couple chapters here a way that this worked out just the opposite of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think if you're expecting God to move in your life or for you in any way, you should make sure that your heart is directed and oriented towards Him. Because if it's not, then it's probably the direction He's moving is not with you and for you.
That's right.
Yeah.
Might be a little more disciplinary.
Yeah. So be careful.
Yes, right.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about these memorial stones. I think this was a big theme of Deacon's message on Sunday, was really keying in on these memorial stones and the significance of them. Talk a little bit about why these are so important.
Yeah, well, the stones celebrate God's faithfulness, which is a big theme here in the book of Joshua. The stones really say this: God keeps His promises, every single one. And so these stones become a tangible prompt for an intergenerational conversation. So when future children asked about their meeting, I don't know, when they were out on a family trip and they saw these 12 big stones piled up out there, and they would ask their parents what these stones mean, the parents had an opportunity then to explain how the waters of the Jordan stopped flowing before the Ark of the Covenant, and that God was faithful to His promises. So God's works are to be remembered, for God's people. They were a constant reminder that God was personal and powerful, working wonders on their behalf. And this faith is now being passed down generationally. And the stones give the parents an opportunity to do that. And they're a spiritual safeguard against forgetfulness, which is a major theme in the book of Deuteronomy. And it's also One of the ways that the Israelites did not do well on was remembering all the ways that a God had came through for them. And I also think it's interesting that these weren't just random rocks. They were riverbed rocks, normally hidden by the flowing water, but now they're kind of lifted up as a testimony. So this whole thing was to spark gratitude and spark future faith and obedience, so that it says here in Joshua 4, verse 24, so that they may fear the Lord their God forever. Because once you remember what God has done, it leads you to revere the Lord, and revering the Lord leads to obedience, and then obedience leads to blessings. So probably the only other thing I would want to say about the memorial stones, and you might want to throw a thought in here on it, is that these stones, I think, in a great way foreshadow Jesus. The most significant victory for us worth remembering is not the stones of the Israelites. That was for them. Although it's a great story for us to inspire faith. What we remember is Jesus, his life, his death, and his resurrection. And we are to remember that and not forget it. Because once you forget that, then our faith begins to falter. And I think it's interesting that the Lord gave us this one practice, this one ordinance, the Lord's Supper, to be doing on a regular basis as a memorial, to keep thinking and remembering back on Christ's saving act. Jesus said, whenever you do this in remembrance of me. So that is our great memorial stone.
Yeah, I really like that. I think the other thing I was thinking about with the stones is, one, I think the significance of picking stones is really important, right? Because they're solid, they're heavy, and they last for generations, right? Like you're just gonna put it there and it's gonna stay. Like you don't have to worry about it falling apart or disintegrating or anything. The second thing I was thinking about just this morning was that they're kind of an impossibility. Right, like these stones, like there would be no other way for them to have gotten these stones than if the river parted, right? Because these are in the middle of this rushing river.
Right.
There's no way they would have gone down into this river, pulled out these stones, unless it had split apart, dried up, and they could carry them out by hand, right? And so it is like this very tangible, real reminder, and there's no other way that they could have these stones in the first place unless God performed this miracle, unless God showed his faithfulness in this moment. So it serves as like this really cool, tangible reminder for them in that moment, which I think is just awesome.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So anything else kind of from this last weekend's message or from these couple chapters before we want to wrap this up?
Well, I was struck by a couple thoughts that Deacon shared, and I liked what he said. He said this, he said, we tend to remember our failures and betrayals and regrets more than we remember God's faithfulness. And boy, do I think that is just so true. Fear or anxiety has a short memory for grace. We face a new little challenge on one day, and suddenly all of God's great works in our lives, and particularly the great work of the cross and the resurrection of Jesus, become such a distant memory for us, and we're not even thinking about it so very much. Some of us immediately go to worst case scenarios in our life. We face an obstacle or a challenge, and we immediately go to all the things that could possibly go wrong, and it produces such anxiety in us. And if we forget what God has done, then what's going to invariably happen is that we're going to fear the future. We'll be anxious about the future. And so we really are to remember, because when we remember, we're establishing a testimony in our minds that God really cares for me. And if he's cared for me in the past, he's going to care for me in the future. The problem is we rehearse our fears more than we rehearse God's faithfulness. And Deacon mentioned that, and I think it's just so true. And we see this very same thing play out for the Israelites. Their people, just like us, they did a lot of forgetting, that God cared for them. And in fact, in Psalm 106, traces much of Israel's spiritual slide, and it traces it. The psalmist traces it to them just forgetting. And I'll just read a one little portion of Psalm 106. It says, "The people made a calf at Mount Sinai. They bowed before an image made of gold. They traded their glorious God for a statue of a grass-eating bull. They forgot God, their Savior, who had done such great things in Egypt, such wonderful things in the land of Ham." We think about if you were there at the Red Sea and you saw all those miracles, would you have forgotten it? You would think it would have been so impressed on their hearts. They never would have forgotten about it. But this generation did. They forgot such wonderful things in the land of Ham, such awesome deeds at the Red Sea. So he declared that he would destroy them. But Moses, his chosen one, stepped between the Lord and the people. He begged him to turn from his anger and not destroy them. The people refused to enter the pleasant land. That was the first generation of the Israelites. Why did they not enter it? It says here, for they wouldn't believe his promise to care for them. Instead, they grumbled in their tents and refused to obey the Lord. So the first generation of Israelites who faced that promised land, they caved in to their fear. They caved into the obstacles they saw. They imagined the worst case scenario on the other side of the river facing those giants, and we look like just grasshoppers in their sight, and they completely forgot God's care for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, and I think Deacon kind of challenged us in the same way. We face the next obstacle in life. Have we forgotten that God's going to carry us? God's going to care for us. Deacon said this, whatever shapes your story shapes your life. And then he challenged us to write down 3 ways that God's been faithful. Well, the biggest one is God's cared for us by the cross, by the story of Jesus. And I can think of 3 huge ways that God's cared for me over the years. My marriage, there's a big story behind that. Moving up here from Ames to help start the church and seeing the city of Minneapolis for the first time at that Burnsville Hill and thinking to myself, what did I get myself into? And then God's carried me through for the years. Financially, he's come through in some very miraculous ways. I mean, I can think back on some really amazing ways, and I need to let that shape me as I now face my getting older. Is God going to care for me all the way up until I die?
Yeah, that's really good. That kind of ties in a little bit to the thing that I think I've been chewing on since then, of one of the biggest differences between this and the Red Sea story is the sea being dried up before they enter when they're going into the Red Sea, right? But this one, he commands the priest to step into the water first.
That's right.
And what I was thinking about there, and this kind of ties back into where we started our conversation of looking for Jesus versus looking for ourselves. And I was just kind of thinking about that, of Jesus is our high priest, right? He's the one who stepped into the water for us. And the rest of the people, they got to walk in through on dry land, right? It was the priest that stepped in the water. And our priest already did step into the water. He stopped it from keeping going, and he paved the way for us to go safely. So there's a lot of times where it feels like, man, we got to take this big risk. We got to take this big step of faith out into this rushing water. But he already stepped out there for us, right? Like it's already dry ground. He's already given us victory in life. And like all we have to do is trust him and follow him through.
That's right.
And come with him.
That's good.
So yeah, I think that's, and so holding on to those times where we've seen him do that, and then pressing forward and trusting that he's going to do it again.
Amen.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here, for being a part of this conversation. Thank you guys for tuning in. We're going to continue next week as we continue our walk through the book of Joshua. If you're listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify or anything like that, no, there's a video version of this up on YouTube. If you're watching up on YouTube, we've got audio versions of this available anywhere. But we'll catch you next time. If you got any questions, you can send those in to us at podcast@hometownchurch.com. We'll see ya.
Bye-bye. Wow.